As you know, life is never simple, and it's not just a case of reducing our inputs and increasing our outputs. We need to work out whether there's a cost benefit to chasing improvements in milking efficiency. And milking efficiency itself is quite complicated in that different factors influence milking efficiency. Things like udder health, milk quality, and then the resources that we have available to us can all influence the end result of whether we have an efficient milking or a less efficient milking. So if we were looking at a real definition of milking efficiency, it would be to spend as little money as necessary to collect as much saleable milk as possible, and to do that in as short a period as possible. And you'll notice that there's a couple of words in bold there. Spending as little money as necessary is very different to spending as little money as possible, because with any strong business, we'll need a certain amount of investment, but we don't want to invest any more than we need to. We want to keep that cost benefit at a sensible level. And then you'll notice as well, we're not just talking about collecting as much milk as possible. That milk has to be saleable. So there's no point us milking the cows in super fast time if we're pouring half of that milk down the drain because it's mastitis milk or it's milk from cows that are under treatment. And by a similar token, we need the milk quality to be of a level which means we're maximising the milk check. A milking isn't an efficient milking unless we're getting every penny or every tenth of a penny possible per litre of milk produced. And we've talked about how udder health and milk quality will contribute to our milking efficiency. But the interesting thing that we find when we're working with farmers to improve efficiency is that when we actually change our milking routine and make adjustments to the milking machine to improve milking speed, that normally has a knock-on effect to improve udder health and milk quality as well. So it's a bit of a positive circle there. And that brings us on to other benefits that we can get from an efficient milking. We only have 24 hours in the day. And just as we're busy trying to fit every job that we have into that 24 hours, the cows also have quite a tight schedule to fit everything in that they need to. So to get best productivity out of our cows, they need to lie down for at least 11 hours every day. Again, for maximum productivity, we need a good 7, 8, even 9 hours of eating time a day to make sure that we're getting the dry matter intakes that we want for our yield. So if we take that as an average of 8 hours, already we've lost 19 hours out of our 24. And then it's important that we give our cows time to interact with each other. So 2.5 hours of socializing is vital if we want our cows to show signs of estrus and be as happy and healthy as they can. And then, of course, we know that milk comes from water, and particularly at this time of year when it's warm, we need to budget sufficient time for cows to drink. So in the middle of winter, they might only need half an hour to drink. In the middle of summer, that might be approaching more like 60 minutes. And so we can see that without even doing anything extra in our day, we're up to about 21.5 or 22 hours there, which is only leaving us 2 hours to fit in all of the management tasks that we have. Now, that could be trimming feet, it could be inseminating cows, it could be moving cows around the farm. But of course, the big thing that we need to fit in there is milking. And so effectively, we've got between an hour and an hour and a half to milk those cows before we start eating in to the budget for the other tasks in the day. And so if milking's taking the cows away from those other tasks for 2 hours, 2.5 hours each day, something's got to give. And by reducing time available for the other tasks the cow has, we're reducing feed intake, we're increasing the time she's standing on concrete, and so yield, mobility, fertility, all of these things are going to suffer. So efficient milking isn't just about udder health, it has a knock-on effect on the general health of the cow as well. And from our point of view, an efficient milking makes it much nicer from a milking team, a staff point of view. There's nothing that saps morale from the milking team like knowing that it's going to take them 3 hours to milk 120 cows in an afternoon. And of course, milking efficiency has a financial implication as well. Basically, we want to spend as little as money as possible to make as much money as possible. And by improving milking efficiency, we may be able to dilute down our fixed costs and reduce our variable costs. So what actually is milking efficiency? How can we know whether we've got an efficient milking setup or not? Well, there's lots of different metrics that we can use to measure efficiency. An old favourite is cows per hour, but actually this isn't necessarily the most useful measure, because 100 cows per hour, if those cows are 40-litre cows, is a much more efficient milking than 100 cows per hour if those cows are 20-litre cows. So the only time I would really look at cows per hour as a useful metric is for those herds that are milking a lot of cows 3 times a day and we're running out of time in the day for the number of cows that we have. A better measure for most UK herds would be milk per hour. And this is a good measure because it ties in to the bottom line. It ties into the financial measures of milking efficiency. But if you're trying to compare your milking efficiency to your neighbour's milking efficiency, it might not be the best way of comparing, because milk per hour is affected quite strongly by the size of the milking parlour. So if you want to compare your 20-unit milking parlour to your friend round the corner, his or her 40-unit milking parlour, you're better using a measure like milk per stall per hour, because this tells you how effective you are at using your own resources and isn't influenced by things that are outside of your control. But one measure that we have at Advanced Milking we've invented really over the last couple of years is milking margin per hour. And the reason that this is useful is it tells us how well we're performing from a financial point of view. And this can be quite a good benchmark for your own performance this year compared to last year, compared to the year before. So basically, our milking margin per hour looks at the milk revenue, so the amount of milk that we're producing and the price we're getting for it, and then it subtracts the costs of harvesting that milk. So as we've said, the amount of milk we produce and the revenue that we get with our milk price will depend on milk quality and cow health. Other areas of this sum are variable costs, so things like our labour costs, chemical use, electricity bill, water bill, and our fixed costs, which essentially boils down to our capital investment for the milking machine and perhaps the building which that machine is in, divided by the payoff period, the lifespan of that kit. And of course, there's a lot of different variables to consider in those costs. But in actual fact, the costs are only a small influence on the overall milking margin. The biggest influence is the left-hand side, our milking revenue. And unfortunately for us, as we find with so many costing situations, milk price is the most influential factor. And that's a real pain in the backside, given that milk price is outside of our control. But the good news is milk per hour is almost as influential, and that is within our control. So these different measures can all be used for different situations. There isn't necessarily a right metric or a wrong metric. They'll all be useful than 100 cows per hour. But even if cows per hour was a good measure for our herd, that figure is well outdated. And so we need some newer information to fine tune these targets. Some of our more relevant targets, such as milk per stall per hour, have targets that come from, say, the USA or Israel. And so they could be relevant to us. But unless we compare our UK situation, we just don't know for sure. And so back in 2017, myself and my colleague started a project looking into some UK key performance indicators. And we started off with 90 herds from across Scotland, England and Wales, mostly England and Wales to be fair. And since then we've added a lot more data from other herds. The herds that we looked at were a real mix, anything from 60 cows to 1,500 cows, and extensive systems with low yields all the way up to super intensive housed cows giving 40 odd litres. And the milking machines as well across this sample of herds was highly varied. We had rotaries, we had herringbones, we had a breast parlours. The only thing we didn't look at was automatic milking systems, robots, because we've got fairly well established targets for automatic systems, and they are totally different from the ways that we would measure conventional milking efficiency. So we looked at the different efficiency measures across these herds and came up with a nice description of how our UK herds were performing by these different measures. If we look at the image on the left-hand side, this is our cows per hour, and the green box shows where the middle 50% of herds were. So the middle 50% of herds were putting between 90 and 150 cows per hour through at their milkings. The line underneath the box here shows the spread of the least efficient 25%, and the line above the box here shows the most efficient 25% of herds. So we can see that 25% of herds were putting more than 150 cows through, and the top 50% of herds were putting more than 110 cows through. So using that for all of these different measures, we can come up with some UK-based targets. So if we take a target as what the top 25% are managing to achieve, and an intervention point as what the top half of herds are achieving, we can come up with figures for our favourite measures. So milk per hour, cows per hour, milk per stall per hour. But before you all take a mental note of these figures, it's worth us just thinking about who has contributed to these figures and what that means for how we use the data. Like any group average or national average, we have to make sure that that data is relevant to our herd. So what we find with this average data, this kind of whole group data, is it's really skewed by our rotary milking herds. So if we just look at the performance of the rotary herds, we can see that they've got really high milk per hour, 3,500 litres as their target, and really high cows per hour, 270 cows per hour. And so they've really skewed the figures if we were to use those group figures. So instead, for herringbone herds, we need to look at the data from our herringbone group. And this gives us a totally different set of targets. So our milk per hour would be around 1,600 litres per hour, our cows per hour 130, and our milk per stall per hour 55 litres. But again, the devil's in the detail. And if we drill into those herringbone herds, we can split them by swingover versus double up. Now, the interesting thing with this is our headline targets, cows per hour and milk per hour, are broadly the same. But of course, milk per stall per hour is going to be very different, because our swingovers only have half the number of milking units that they do stalls. So we can still use these different measures for double ups and swingovers, but it's inappropriate to use the same targets. We need a different set of targets for the different herd situation. But the really interesting thing about our study is looking at the variation that we've got. If we quickly flick back to see the spread, we've got an enormous spread between the most efficient and the least efficient businesses that were examined. So what we're interested in is looking at what features of management are associated with those most efficient herds versus the least efficient herds. And we can look at all sorts of different things that are going on farm and work out what are the common factors that are associated with good or bad performance. But some of these are red herrings. So if we look at that top line, it's tempting to say, oh, well, increasing cow numbers increases efficiency. But of course, it isn't cause and effect. There's no reason to believe that we can make an inefficient milking more efficient just by putting more cows on the farm. That doesn't make any sense at all. So this highlights that sometimes it isn't cause and effect, it's just an association. And of course, it makes sense that the bigger herds are more efficient, because if they were less efficient, there wouldn't be enough hours in a day for them to milk. So what makes them more efficient? Well, perhaps it's parlour size. We can see here that the more efficient herds on the right-hand column have bigger parlours, more milking units than the less efficient herds. But again, we can't say for sure that they're more efficient because they have bigger parlours. There could be something else which is associated with bigger parlours, which is making them more efficient. For example, here we can see that there's also an association between the more efficient herds and greater use of ACRs. So this leads us onto a concept that is always present when we're trying to unpick what makes a situation the way it is. And this is the problem that we have with different factors on farm confounding each other. So confounding is when you have two factors that could cause a certain end result, but they're linked together. So we don't know which one is actually responsible for that end result. And this can lead to a lot of confusion about what we can do on farm to improve milking efficiency. Just because two things occur together doesn't necessarily mean one causes the other, a little bit like our example of herd size. But what we can do is use statistics to separate out all of these different related influences and work out which ones are actually causing an improvement in milking efficiency and which ones are just a coincidence. And so that's exactly what we did. With our key performance indicator project, we ran a fairly complicated model that analysed all of these different variables and allowed us to pick out the ones that were actually relevant to improving milking efficiency. And so we ended up with some interesting headlines. The first is that herd size doesn't influence milking efficiency. Bigger herds might be more efficient, but that's because they have to be. They're not more efficient because they're bigger. And yield doesn't have a strong influence efficiency down a little. But as a general rule, cow yield isn't closely related to our efficiency measures. And the number of milkings per day doesn't influence efficiency either. Twice a day, 3 times a day, we can be just as efficient with either. But what does influence milking efficiency, certainly in terms of the milk that we harvest per hour, is the size of parlour. So if we want to compare performance of a big parlour, a medium parlour and a small parlour, we have to use efficiency measures at the individual milking unit level. So milk per stall per hour or milk per milking unit per hour. The interesting thing about parlour size is the gap between efficiency of big parlours and small parlours narrows a little bit when we factor in that those larger parlours cost more to buy and install and have greater running costs. So the gap may not be as big as people think when you look at a small, cheap and cheap to run parlour compared to a large, expensive and dearer to run parlour. But it remains a general rule that the bigger the parlour, the more efficient our milking will be. And the type of parlour has an effect as well. So we know that rotary parlours are more efficient than linear parlours. Our milk per hour in a 60-point rotary will be nearly 600 kilos more than milk per hour through a 60-point herringbone, for instance. Interestingly, there's no significant difference in milk per hour between swingovers and double-ups. So hopefully that goes some way to putting that bitter pub argument to bed. And what we have within our milking machine can influence milking efficiency quite profoundly as well. So if we have automatic cluster removal, we're likely to see much greater milking efficiency, particularly if we move away from the traditional low flow rates that a lot of milking machines have been set at over the last 10 or 20 years. So if the ACR removes the cluster at more than 300 mils per minute, we start seeing a big jump up in our milk per stall per hour, almost 10 kilos extra per stall per hour. An interesting side shoot of this project was we found that nearly half of the dairy farmers in the survey didn't actually know their ACR settings. And so that gives us something to work with straight away. Going home and checking out what the ACRs are actually set at is a good start point for many of the farmers that we work with. But my favourite finding out of the study, and the more data we feed into the model, the more this finding is confirmed, is that teat preparation, wiping the teats or dipping and wiping the teats or spraying the teats, anything we do to the teats before milking doesn't reduce our milking efficiency, even though it delays us putting the units onto the cows. And to me, that's really significant because a big part of my job is trying to reduce mastitis risks for herds. And so I'll say to people, right, we need to get these teats cleaner before we attach the unit. And people will often push back and say, oh, we really don't want to start wiping the teats before we put the cups on. It'll slow milking down. And in actual fact, it doesn't at all. If anything, it slightly improves milking efficiency. And if we look at these graphs, we can see the reason for that. The graph on the left-hand side shows the milk flow rates for the milking of a cow who's just had the cups attached as soon as she arrives in the milking parlour. And what we see is initially her milk flow rises, but then 30 seconds into milking, her milk flow drops. And this is what we call biphasic milking or bimodal milking. And this really slows the milking down. So not only do we have about 40 seconds of zero flow, but it also takes longer for that cow to milk out at the end of milking. So we can see that this particular cow has taken about 6.5 minutes to milk out. The same cow, if we stimulate her teats, about 90 seconds in this case before attaching the unit, has a very different milk flow pattern. she goes straight up to high flow. She stays at high flow for all of milking, and then she finishes quite abruptly. And that's because she's had a really good milk letdown, because we've touched the teats to stimulate milk letdown, and we've waited the right amount of time before attaching the unit. And so although we lost 90 seconds at the beginning of her milking, she actually milked out in 4.5 minutes. So her total time is still only 6 minutes, which is still a little bit quicker than if she'd had one of these biphasic milkings, because we just put the cups on. So that's great news. It means that we can improve teat hygiene, we can improve milk flow, and it doesn't cost us anything in terms of milking efficiency. In fact, because these things reduce the chance of getting mastitis, it might actually increase milking efficiency. Because we know that milking efficiency drops when we are pouring too much milk down the drain. And we know that milking efficiency drops when we have cows under treatment, because of course it disrupts milking. We have to put those cows on the bucket, or we have to have a separate group which gets milk to dump, and we have to stop to tube or inject those cows. So the better our udder health and the less cows under treatment for mastitis or any other illness for that matter, the more efficient our milking is going to be. So to summarize, we can improve milking efficiency firstly by considering what our situation is and measuring milking efficiency in the right way and using the right targets to see whether we've got a problem. Now, if you're above target for your situation, happy days. You can leave milking efficiency alone, safe in the knowledge that you're performing well. But if you're not perhaps hitting the targets that you want, then first thing really is to check that there isn't mileage in reducing the non-saleable milk and reducing the cows under treatment. And also check that we're getting the full value for every litre of milk sold. Are we getting our milk quality bonuses, our cell count bonuses? And tied in with that is the milking machine itself. Are we achieving good milk flow from our cows? And are the cluster removal settings allowing us to maximize milking efficiency by reducing unit on time for the cows? So that's a whistle-stop tour of milking efficiency. There's obviously a ton of detail that we haven't had time to cover. So if you have any questions about any particular points from the last half hour, then I'd be happy to take some questions, or any questions in general about efficiency topics that we haven't covered today.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tom. Very informative and a lot of information to take in there. I am aware there's a lot of figures and graphs there, so we will be sharing the presentation post-meeting. So yeah, that'll be available to everyone to look back on. There has been, I think there's a question come in, but just a quick reminder to everyone else, please put your questions. There's a link at the bottom where you can put the QA and type your questions there. But just a comment quickly before we go to the questions, Tom. I facilitate a dairy discussion group, and this is something we did look on as a group. And before a meeting, we got everyone to record the timing for every aspect of the parlour work to improve milking efficiency. You mentioned it's quite difficult to compare with other systems, other parlour types and so forth, and something we did was get everyone to record to time each individual step within that milking. But the biggest variance was within different members of the family or different workers within the system, and I think that itself created a good discussion within that business itself. So you're benchmarking against other people within your own system in a way, and I suppose
it's interesting. It's an interesting side point that about different members of the milking team on the same farm having quite different figures when you're looking at the timings of the milking routine.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's quite important to try and reduce those differences as much as possible, because what we found is that cows have certain figures which are suitable for that herd, but as much as that, they have a big love for consistency. We know this from things like diet and all of the other aspects of cow management. Consistency is key, and it's just the same with this. Cows will prefer us to do the milking routine slightly less than perfectly, but the same every single time, than they would perfect half the time and rubbish half the time. So it's better finding something that everyone in the milking team can stick to. Even if it's not 100% perfect, you'll get better results from that consistent approach than being up and down like a yo-yo, good one milking and then different the next.
Yeah, I suppose it's getting the balance, isn't it? It's not to cut corners, and you know, if someone comes in and does the weekends and get them, they just get them in and out as quickly as possible. Well, you know,
Yeah.
you don't affect the yield and the quality and have the knock-on effect on health issues, as you mentioned.
Well, it's interesting because in terms of milking efficiency, we see quite often the bulk tank volume being down after certain relief staff. So people are coming on a Monday and they'll say, oh, I knew that the tank could be down 800 litres today because such and such was working at the weekend. And if we're trying to maximise the amount of milk we're producing, sometimes it isn't about being quick. So those relief staff who come in and they might knock 50 minutes off milking, it's only 50 minutes well spent if it isn't reflected in the bulk tank at the next collection. So it's like you say, cost benefit. Cutting corners is only good if it doesn't cut results as well.
Yeah, it's a good exercise to do. I know it takes time to record everything individually, but it seems like a good exercise to do now and then, just to see where everyone within the business is at.
For sure, yeah.
We'll move on to the questions, Tom. There's a few come through. We'll start with a question from John. Good afternoon, John. Our ACR setting is 150. Should it be higher, and would this lead to a greater number of cases of mastitis?
Yeah, it's a good question. And if you'd said it was 250 or 300, I might have hedged my bets and said, you know what, without coming out to your farm and making some measurements, it's hard to know for sure. But actually at 150, I can tell you categorically that you will see huge benefits from increasing from 150 to say 300 mils per minute. And there are two worries that people have with that. The first worry is people worry that they're going to lose milk from the bulk tank. And of course that makes sense, doesn't it? Because if we're taking the unit off earlier and we're leaving more milk in the cow, then it stands to reason that milk isn't going to be going in the tank. But actually, although that sort of makes sense, it isn't borne out in what we see. So in practice, increasing those ACR takeoff flow rates, it will drop down milk yield for 24 hours, but then you'll go up to where you were before and probably even a little bit higher. So it's common for us to hear people report back and say, actually, milk yield's gone up, nothing else has changed, and we thought that we'd go down, but we're half a litre per cow up. And we see this so often. And the reason for that is that final part of milking is very uncomfortable for the cow when we've got these really low ACR settings. And because it's uncomfortable, she doesn't let her milk down as well when she comes into the parlour. And so she always holds on to a little bit more residual milk. And so we think that we're getting more milk out the cow by leaving the unit on, but actually we're just making that cow cling onto her milk a bit more. So you're not going to lose any milk. Now, the second worry, and this is the second half of your question, is will you see more mastitis? And again, that's something that all of us who've milked cows have had drilled into us. If we leave the cluster on the cow if we don't leave the cluster on the cow long enough, if we leave milk in a quarter, then we're going to start to see more cases of mastitis. And in actual fact, we've proved that to not be the case. The reason that generations of dairy farmers have thought that was the case is that when cows are brewing up a case of mastitis, they don't let their milk down as well. And we know that's true. We know that it's harder to strip out a quarter that's got an infection in it. And it can be quite difficult to totally strip out that quarter. So a cow gets a case of mastitis, and because of that, she holds on to her milk in that quarter. And so to us, it looks like she's not milking out particularly well in that quarter. And then the following day, she's got full-blown clots in that quarter. So all we've seen is a quarter that's not milked out well, and then a case of mastitis. But actually, the case of mastitis hasn't come because the quarter wasn't milked out. The quarter wasn't milked out particularly well because that cow was already infected and already brewing up a case of mastitis. And so that's led to this myth that if we undermilk our cows, we will increase our mastitis risk. And based on this idea, one of the American universities took the university dairy herd and they milked out the front left and the back right quarters completely, just as you would with your 150 mil per minute setting, John. And the opposite two quarters, they left a lot of milk on. And we're talking leaving like 2.5 litres of milk in each quarter. And what they found was at the end of a month of this, the mastitis rate between the overmilked and the undermilked quarters was exactly the same. So that goes to show that even if we leave a ton of milk in these quarters, we don't actually increase the mastitis risk. So obviously I don't know your farm, John, and I don't know your cows and your milking machine, but I can confidently say that you would see benefits by increasing those ACR settings from 150 mils per minute to 300 mils per minute, and you wouldn't see any downsides to that. But of course, to look into things in more detail would always be a wise plan. You don't always want to be shooting in the dark with these machine settings.
Excellent, thank you, Tom. And next question on from that then, with slow cows that have one slow quarter, would manual detachment work and all other cows in row have any detrimental effect in the long run?
Yeah, it's a really good question, that. And I tend to take a bit of a zero tolerance policy with slow milkers these days, in that if we've got a row of 15 cows or however many cows are in the row, the impact on those 14 cows who have milked out in good time and are just standing around is much greater than the impact of taking the cluster off the slow milker a little bit earlier than we perhaps normally would. So rather than make 14 cows wait just to look after one cow, I would say take the unit off that one cow so that she doesn't hold up the whole row. And of course, that can have a huge positive effect on milking efficiency. Question is, what sort of negative effect could that have on that one individual cow? And in actual fact, we see relatively little problems by this ruthless approach. What we tend to find is if we have, say, 5 slow milking cows and we take this zero tolerance approach with them, 3 of them within a week or 10 days will actually speed up their milking. So they're giving more or less the same amount of milk, but they're just doing it in a sensible time, in line with the rest of the cows in the herd or the row. And then the 4th cow will maybe speed up her milking to a certain extent, but not give quite as much milk under this zero tolerance policy. But we're probably only talking about losing 0.5 to 1.5 litres off that cow. And then the 5th cow out of the 5 will just not behave at all. And usually these are cows that have got very narrow teats well, very narrow teat ends, or maybe they've had a previous problem with a teat and they've got some scar tissue in the teat canal or something along those lines. And those cows just can't milk fast. And so in that situation, we've really got two choices. We either just put up with the fact that we're getting a little bit less milk out of that cow, or we give her a career change and she can move from the dairy industry to the beef industry. But most of the time, it makes much more sense to just take the unit off the cow as soon as everyone else has finished, rather than pander to her whims. And you'll be surprised at how many slow milkers actually speed up if you take that zero tolerance approach with them.
Excellent, thank you, Tom. There's another 2 questions. If you've got any more questions, then please put them forward. We'll hopefully have some time to answer them. The next 2 are on teat scrubbing brushes, so I'll put them both in front of you. What is your opinion of ADF and teat scrubbing brushes? Do they increase milking efficiency? The next one then, we have a Swingover and use the brushes to clean the teats. And I have been told to achieve maximum efficiency that I should wash the first 7, then put those units on, then wash the next 7.
Yeah, 2 good points there. So firstly, to talk about ADF. ADF is a brilliant tool to have. There are 2 big benefits to it. One is if you have contagious mastitis, disinfecting the units in between cows will help reduce the spread of that contagious mastitis from one cow to the next. So that's a big advantage. And of course, the other, in line with our topic that we're discussing today, is it automates one of our steps of milking. It means that we don't need to manually spray or dip the teats after milking. And because of that, it can save a bit of time. Now, as to how much of a cost benefit there is in that, it'll vary from herd to herd. If you've got contagious mastitis, there's almost certainly going to be a cost benefit, because that cluster disinfection will be a key part of your management of that contagious mastitis problem. And so you'll almost always get a really good return on investment with ADF if you've got a contagious mastitis problem. If you've not, then we're looking at getting return on investment just by making the post-milking process a bit more quick and efficient. And that's going to vary a lot, really, from herd to herd. It depends whether your milking efficiency is limited by that post-milking routine. Chances are that's only a small part of the overall efficiency of getting cows in, milked, and out of the parlour. So the numbers might be a little bit tighter if we're looking at cost benefit on an automatic dipping and flushing system like ADF or Apollo or some of the other systems that are available. So I don't know if that fully answers the question. What I would say, though, is if it's kept well serviced, ADF achieves pretty good coverage of the teats. So compared to some of the automated spray systems, you're probably going to get a better post-milking disinfection with some of those dip systems. So that's something to consider. The other question about the brushes, there's a couple of different brushes on the market, and they've come on in leaps and bounds since they were first launched. So when they were first launched, there were 2 problems that we saw. And for people who still have the early models, obviously these problems continue. And that is that the bristles were not particularly comfortable on the cows. And so we actually found that because the cows were uncomfortable and stressed, they weren't letting their milk down quite as well. Now they've improved that aspect by pre-curving the bristles on the brushes these days. And off the back of that, we see much better milk letdown, as good as any other pre-milking stimulation. The other element that used to be a problem was the teat cleaning itself. And what we used to find was the drying of the teat end wasn't particularly good. So post-milking, if this is our teat, we used to find that there was a droplet of mucky fluid left at the teat end. And of course, that's going to be a risk for infection. The newer models have got some different strategies to help dry that teat, whether that's a drying cycle of the brushes, which knocks the moisture off the teat, or whether that's air blasts. And by achieving a better drying, we get much better teat hygiene, and we reduce that risk of infection that was a problem previously. What we tend to find is when we look at bacterial contamination of the teat before and after, nothing beats dipping the teat, leaving for 30 seconds and then wiping the teat. With all of the studies that we've done, and other studies elsewhere around the world confirm this, we find that that gives us the biggest bacterial reduction. Having said that, that's a more laborious process. So from a time and effort point of view, it's certainly attractive to use less labour-intensive pre-treatments, such as the brushing. Moving on to the final bit of that question, which was how many cows should you brush before you start attaching the teat? It's going to vary a bit from herd to herd. So 7 cows might be perfect for the herd that we've been talking about here, but it might be different on a herd up the road or another herd around the corner. And the reason for that is we need a different lag time between first touching the teat, which starts that milk letdown process, and attaching the unit based on how full the udder is. So if the udder's really full of milk, we might only need 50 or 60 seconds between first touching the teat and attaching the milking unit. If that udder has got less milk in it, then we might need a longer period of time between touching the teat and putting the cups on. So maybe 80 or 90 or 100 seconds. And the reason for that is that it takes cows with less milk more time to let their milk down after we've stimulated them. And so cows that are stale or low yielders or milked 3 times a day, so they don't have as long to brew milk up in the udder between milkings, all of those will probably need 90 seconds or thereabouts between brushing and attaching. Whereas cows that are milked twice a day, high yielding cows that are in the first 150 days of milk, they'll probably only need 60 seconds. So it's worth having a think about that for your particular herd, working out whether you're going to be closer to the 60-second or the 90-second end of the spectrum, and then working out how long it takes you, how many cows you need to brush, and then walk back to the front to fill your 60 seconds or 90 seconds, depending which it is for your herd. So that'll be where this advice has come from. And it's good advice, but we just need to get the stop clock out and make sure that that 7 cows is giving you the right period of time between touching the teats and cupping the cows.
Excellent, thank you, Tom. I hope that's answered your question, John. And that's all for the questions for today. So we'll bring...
Perfect, good questions. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So we'll bring the webinar to an end. So thank you very much, Tom, for an excellent webinar again.